One thing I certainly learned in consulting is that your organizational culture lives at the front line of managers. That's where you carry the culture for the organization. That's where behavior gets influenced and behavior is held. That's where the rituals are actually play out, like whether they happen or not. That's where all of the work that you try and make real in the kind of 2 to 3 year, the strategy of the organization will either happen or not on the basis of whether or not your frontline managers are aligned with it.
Welcome back to the Thoughts on Selling podcast. Today, it is my absolute pleasure to have Ben Perreau joining me to talk about all things leadership. Ben's hailing in from the other side of the country as opposed to the other side of the pond where he used to reside. He's in California, right, Ben?
That's right. I'm in Los Angeles, California, Lee.
So first question, Ben, and I think you've been studying for this one and preparing at length. Who is Ben Perreau?
It's such a good question because there's so many ways you can answer that question. And I was thinking about it just as you prompted me literally a few minutes ago to give it some thought, and I have been. You know, I think Ben Perreau, to mention him in the third person, is a complex mix of dualities in search of trying to find the one version of myself in amongst all of that. And so I'm now British American, as you can probably tell from my accent and my location. I'm also British Malaysian, as some people can tell from how I look. I'm a recovering journalist turned entrepreneur. Those are dualities at almost the extreme ends of the spectrum these days. And so with all those things, I'm sort of this person who kind of tries to hold all those dualities. And so I'm not really from anywhere. And I don't know if I really identify with being any one specific person. But yeah, I'm in search of, as always, I hope we all are, in search of who the true Ben Perreau is and amongst all of that. And I would say it's probably in transition all the time.
We all are. Anyone that does acknowledge that is giving themselves a line of bullshit, right?
It's true. And I think some of us take a little while to realize that. If you'd asked me that question in my 20s, I might have had more of a cut and dried answer to that, which would have been maybe a less honest representation of the reality in myself.
Yeah, I think the old saying is the more we learn, the less we realize we know.
Yeah, so true. There's like a graph, isn't there, when you sort of find yourself at the trough of disillusion. Oh, I forget exactly how it's represented. I definitely, a few years back, in almost everything I do, I'm an avid photographer when I'm not working, get to that point where I'm really confident and then sort of the next layer opens up. It's almost like you get off the beginner island onto the next island in a video game and you realize that that island is the entirety of Pangea. And you're like, wow, okay, I'm clueless in this world. And I think a few years back, I realized that about the entirety of my existence. So I'm sort of, not to get too deep too quickly, but definitely somebody who's trying to reconcile all those things for sure.
Yeah, I'm a budding photographer too. And, I thought I was a halfway decent photographer until I made the commitment to get off of auto mode.
Oh, yeah, it's so true. And then you're like, okay, right, now I have to master the exposure triangle or whatever it is. And so you're sort of deep in that, figuring all that technical stuff out. And then all of a sudden you've forgotten how to take a picture. And then you're like, oh, composition. So I think there's just so many things to go and learn. And one of the things I love about photography is for as long as I can see, I will be learning. And so I'm excited about that journey, way into my 40s, 50s, 60s, hopefully 70s, I can continue to, maybe 80s, I can continue to learn how to take pictures better.
So truth mode, I went back to auto and I've focused 100% on composition. I had a great joy last week. I presented at the Sales and Enablement Summit that Gerhard Schwantner put on. And I used 10 photos that I took at Lime Rock during a professional auto race, literally while I was leaning over the pit wall, taking photos. I had a pit pass as part of a Nikon workshop. It was all about composition. I had such joy in sharing those photos with people because I took 1,000 photos that day. I selected 10 to tell the story of how customers' needs are changing. And I showed, cars in the pits with bent fenders and all that kind of stuff.
You used to disperse them through the presentation so people got to see those photographs?
Yep.
That's cool. Even in something like photography, there's a leadership lesson for me, which is, you talked about going back to auto mode. When you release yourself from having to worry about too much of the technical stuff, then you can really focus on the what you're doing. And it's always hard sometimes to switch between the two different modes, like the auto mode and the composition are sort of two different parts of photography. And there's more to photography, of course, than that. But for me, honestly, I'm always trying to figure out how better to switch between here's the technical stuff I got to figure out. And here's how to drive a good composition. Here's how to create good experience for everyone I'm working with. And also here's how to just get the good stuff done. And I think photography is a great analogy for that, It's
funny you mentioned that. I had an experience. I was building up a bicycle and I took my first short step into electronic shifting. I went with campy record 12 speed. Welcome to Thoughts on Bicycling and Photography.
It's got very technical. Yeah.
Yeah. I got a 12 speed electronic shifting kit and couldn't get it to work. And it's like people on forums said, have you updated the firmware? It's like, excuse me, on my bicycle? Fuck that. And I went back to cable actuated shifting. It's like, no, I'm not going to ruin cycling because I'm on the bench downloading firmware to my rear derailleur. Hard pass.
And, there's sort of a visceral experience when you're cycling. You're a cyclist and I'm previously a cyclist, but no, I haven't been in a while. There's a visceral experience. It's meant to be sort of your own power is part of the joy of it. I know that there are e-bikes and those things now, but even then you have a relationship with the road. I suppose eventually you can actually disconnect yourself from all of the different components of cycling that are human and find yourself in a place where you're doing it in a very much more automated way. But ultimately, you still got to manage the handlebars yourself, right?
Pretty much. Yeah. So let's talk about your shift from being a journalist, which is, I'm going to muck it up, but say at some level, it's describing what other people are doing, to becoming an entrepreneur of doing it and making it happen. What caused that change?
When I announced the transition from being a journalist to being an entrepreneur and starting our first company, somebody sent me the Theodore Roosevelt speech, The Man in the Arena, and that has stuck with me through my entire career. And obviously I've been humbled along this journey by the experience of being an entrepreneur and how hard it is. So, as you mentioned, I started my career as a music journalist of all things. And so that was a really fun job to have in my 20s. But then realized that I was probably a better product manager and eventually an entrepreneur than I was a journalist, but spent a lot of time in the BBC newsroom and so on figuring that out. There's actually a lot of correlation between the two jobs. Journalists, I have immense respect for journalism. The BBC to me is an institution that needs to be protected at all costs and is an important part of British culture, if not actually the glue in British culture in so many ways. And having been lucky enough to work there, I worked alongside some immensely incredible, noble journalists. And I think it's a noble profession increasingly as it's no longer a lucrative profession.
Right, because anybody can be a journalist today. All you need is a tablet and an internet connection and you can write shit. Doesn't make it good.
That's right. It doesn't make it good. And I think so consistently we encounter opinions that we start to pass off as journalism because we are unable to necessarily discern the difference. And, great journalists have spent time researching, really understanding. And in many ways, like journalism is about trying to channel the closest to the truth that you can get. I'm not sure I ever believe in objective truths. Everyone has their own story, but the closest to the science, the closest to the fact, the closest to the truth that you can get. And it's a journalist's job to filter that and to be able to present it to their audience in a way that brings them closer to what happened.
Yeah, it makes it live. Yeah.
Right. And brings that story to life in a way that is there for the curious to be able to know more about, whether that's current affairs or music or anything else.
I tell my coaching clients and anybody who will listen that you create your world with your words.
It's true. It's true.
Whatever you say, if you say, I'm going to try to do this, it's like, that's a lack of commitment. If a salesperson says to me, I hope to do this, it's like, don't hope, do.
It's true. It's true. And where is the commitment? And you signal that in the small, daily ways you communicate with people that you're around. And sometimes you hear yourself, don't you? You're like, I clock myself saying the word try there. So to your original question, I realized that I was really product managing the build out of what would ultimately become the world's biggest music website. And I was a better product manager than I was a journalist. And so I ended up realizing I was going to build products for the rest of my career. And the similarities are profound. I'm also interviewing, talking to lots and lots of different people, in this case, customers, to understand what's their truth, what are their needs, what are they doing, how are they hacking around a solution to the problem at the moment, and uncovering problems that may or may not exist. And really, it's just a different act of storytelling. You're bringing together a different story with different threads to try and construct the most objective truth you can about what matters to customers in that moment. So
creating and curating a worldview.
Yeah. And that's the other thing, a lot of people treat building technology like it's a scientific pursuit. And there is some science to it, but it's also a deeply emotional pursuit. The best people who are building things, making things, this also building an understanding of how they channel information, how we as emotional beings are channeling the information that we collect so that we can construct the right narrative that feels like it's right for the moment for the people. You as a storyteller of all people will understand that. So that's kind of how I got there.
Yeah, that's so exciting. That's so cool. So you were in the music business.
I was.
Yeah. And then you moved on to something else. Tell us.
Yeah. And then, so after the music business, I was a regular journalist in charge of things like editorial strategy, working at BBC and Sky. And then after my second company, I got a call from this really boutique, quite fascinating strategy and leadership firm called SY Partners, which was formed by, I guess you would call them early 80s Apple people Some people call the founders of that company Steve Jobs' personal staff. They were the folks who were working with him in the 80s and early 90s on some of the core projects that he was most closely connected with. And when he went to do the next thing and then went back to Apple, they left and founded their own company. And that company ended up being a strategy firm that went in to so many Fortune 50 organizations to help them figure out where their future was going to be. And so I was lucky enough to work at that company for almost 8 years, working alongside C-level leaders at places like PayPal, AT&T, JP Morgan Chase and Co., all of the big tech companies that you recognize in terms of those big 3 or 4 as well. And just really got to experience and understand, one, I was not American, so I was learning about business in the USA, which is actually profoundly different to the business climate in Europe, in my experience. And also, what do great leaders do that's different to the rest of us? How do they behave? What does their day look like? And I was fielding phone calls on a Sunday night at 11:40, as I'm sure I've used so many times, Lee. It's 11:45 on a Sunday night and somebody's anxious about their presentation. And that person just happens to be a C-level leader at a, Fortune 50 tech company.
Even they put their pants on one leg at a time.
Totally. And actually, that was the most profound realization for me, was that despite at that point being a sort of late 30-something consultant who was in a room I probably shouldn't have been in, at that point in my career.
Wait, Ben. What reality are you creating with your words there? You earned that space, you performed in that space, and it gave you the launch pad to do your next big thing. So cut it out.
Thank you. You can send me the invoice for that one later. So, I guess I got to experience what it was like working with those folks. And I guess that was what led me to start to think about how we might be able to create more access for people doing that.
As you were talking, some faces flashed in my head. The guy that built the Internet Archive, he and I were in AP Physics together in high school. The guy that designed the RFC 822 email, good guy, Dave Crocker. The guy that designed DNS, Acapetris. These are original Internet folks. I've worked with all of them, and I went to school with some of them. And again, they put their pants on one leg at a time. Actually, that's not true. Some of them are so fucking smart, they forget to put their pants on completely. But other than that, yeah. So there is that humanity about them. And there's that absent-minded, like they're off creating stuff that is just unimaginable to 99% of the population, including me. Brewster Kahle and I were at opposite ends of the grading curve in AP Physics. He pulled me up, I pulled him down, whatever. It's all good. So you had this brush with people who had certain capabilities that are outside the norm. My son hung out a bit with Zdeno Chara, the captain of the Boston Bruins. And one of his distinguishing features is he's about 14 feet taller than my son, because Zdeno is like 7'6", and my son's 5'7". But they were in business. My son was a supplier to him. And so one, he's like huge, and two, he's a damn good hockey player. So people have these various sparks, and sometimes they find channels in business to apply those sparks in a way that dramatically drives things forward. And I think some of it, Ben, is, and I say this as someone with a good, solid case of ADHD, some people see things that others don't. And when you see things that other people don't, you have the opportunity to drive things and set context and show paths to other people that they wouldn't otherwise see.
That's a really good way of putting it, Lee. I also am somebody who, as you can probably tell from my background, suffers from fairly horrendous ADHD. I think a lot of people are fearful of counter-narratives, but actually it's the counter-narratives. What was it Margaret Mead say? Never doubt that a small, committed group of people can change the world. In fact, it's all it ever has.
I love that quote.
It's one of my favorites too. It makes me think about what it takes to be part of one of those cohorts of people who chooses to do that. Say that again. Starts with one. It always starts with one, right?
And one who is a good enroller of others, because you have to enroll other people in the vision.
Which is sort of the essence of one of the most important leadership skills, right? Which is sort of storytelling, vision, to the extent to which you can really start to enroll people. You can build that infectious enthusiasm for an idea you just really believe in. And these leaders at these kinds of companies, to some extent, have been able to do that in a field that they are able to generate traction in. And I think that's, I think there's a lot of similarities between people who are sort of early in their career and these kinds of leaders, perhaps more than we would imagine. But I think one of the things that really sets them apart is their ability to be that one and to have the courage to say, hey, listen, I'm going to make a choice here that might be counter to conventional wisdom in this point.
And then hold the unwavering focus on it, no matter what the naysayers say.
That's a really good point. If you can hold the unwavering focus on it and show that grit and determination and continue to push when others might not, that's when you start to generate the kinds of outcomes that others would not as well, right? And I guess you must have seen that in your work because you've coached a lot of leaders in different moments in their careers who've been thinking about, how they're going to build, a convening power around this idea that they've got. I'm curious what you've observed along the way about those kinds of folks too.
Yeah, the human being is a really curious amalgamation of voices, right? We all have voices on our shoulders, and the voices on our shoulders are recordings that other people put there. You suck, you suck, you suck. You never amount to anything. You're really good at this. You shouldn't do that. You should do this. Some call it the inner critic or the inner judge, the inner sage, the inner saboteur. And the key is to realize they're just voices. They're not who you are, right? It's not the inner you. I have a coaching client who in their first conversation with me said that someone had told them most of their life that they would never amount to anything. And how can you be a good field rep at a 3-letter company and carry that with you? How do you go into an engagement with a VP when you have that self-doubt? And in that specific situation, the person that said it to them didn't know any other way. It was carried down from generation to generation. And I pointed out that they didn't have to live with that. They could say, literally, fuck you. And boom, done. And it took months when the individual. So as a coach, I mostly focus on performance mindset, right? It's what's going on in your head that will allow you to prep for a meeting and be present in a conversation with a difficult client or push forward against something. And a lot of it is just focusing on commitment versus addiction, right? The addiction of feeling bad or saying, I can't do it, or I'm not going to push that hard. I had a coaching client who had a deal stall. And this is a funny little story. The customer said to him, we don't know if we're going to do the software upgrade. So I said to him, if they don't do the upgrade, what might happen? He said, well, the elevators might stop working. And I said, okay, and what if that happens? He said, patients might get caught in elevators. Okay, hospital was the customer. And so I said, and if patients get caught in the elevators, what might happen? Patients could die. So I said to him, how do you feel about that? Because the soundtrack in his head was, I'm a field rep and I do what I can do. And right, there's an intellectual conversation and I'm going to bring the facts and I'm going to talk about the benefits and advantages. But it's like, hello, what's really going on? What's really going on is because the organization has an inability to make a decision, they're putting patient lives at risk. And so I asked him, how do you feel about that? And the second time I asked him that, he said, I'm angry. I said, go take that anger to your customer. And a day later, the deal closed.
Nice.
And I said, from a coaching standpoint, and I said, next time, bring that passion into the conversation earlier. You have to moderate it. You have to manage it, but passion is good. We think so much that, well, this is why I love playing hockey, because I can, go into the corner and beat on someone. We aren't supposed to do that in polite society, but we're animals too, in a good way. We are animals. We're so trained to be intellectual animals in the worlds that we inhabit, right? The selling stuff and talking to people and writing stuff and talking. Well, music is a little bit different because music, what's the music soothes the savage beast? Is that the phrase? Some quote like that of like the impact of music is not mostly intellectual. It's mostly emotional. It's visceral. And so you come from a place where what you were providing was a visceral response to what you had to offer, right? We don't get to do that very much in polite society.
No, to your point, we've almost constructed or built our own landscape to help us find our own way out of the sort of emotional meat sacks that we all are in the world. Do you know what I mean? And the more we disconnect ourselves from that, the more that I think we start to find the reality of our own emotional selves starts to find weird ways out of us.
Inappropriate outlets.
Yeah. And so I think it's important for all of us to try and bring these two selves together so that you can express yourself. Everyone has to find, for me, music, we talked about photography, music, these things are ways for me to express myself. And I have to have them in order to be able to feel like I'm a human at peace with myself, To
be the whole you.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's so funny that you should mention the healthcare person you were working with. I worked with one of the big hospital companies for a year. And, there's a reason why they're risk averse, right? They have all these important outcomes that are happening. People die. But we had to spend a lot of time working with that company to help them work out a decision-making framework for when they could take risks and when they could not, because, the word clinical literally is a synonym for lack of emotion. And so sort of you have to recognize that even in a hospital environment, emotions are real. Like stuff is happening in those contexts of those places. And so if you're working with somebody who's involved in the healthcare profession, they've got emotions. They're real people. They have anger that they bring to a situation too. And so I think it's just important to recognize that no matter what context you're in. And I think we have tried to breed a lot of that stuff out of the scientific process that we regard as work, but actually increasingly I'm of the belief that work is not a scientific process at all.
I love that. I had Alistair Corey on as a guest early this year, and he talked about, he's a certified accountant in the UK. I'm not sure what the correct term is.
Chartered accountant, I think would be the right phrase.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Yeah.
Yeah, chartered accountant. And he and I both have done a lot of work in the inner game, which was originally Tim Galway, the inner game of tennis, but now it's the inner game of business. And it's bringing yourself one of what do you know to do as opposed to what do you think about doing. And he's brought agile to chartered accounting. And so less thinking, more doing. And it turns out his results are better. Wait, what? For accounting.
For accounting, which is not one of the professions you'd ever expect to be, using agile methods. And, I can't imagine how he was able to deploy that with a group of people who I imagine resisted it, to begin with, at least.
And then they did an evaluation. They found out that his results were significantly better and faster.
Wow. What a cool result. But also, you'd feel great for having had that impact on the industry. Once you can start to talk about those kinds of outcomes, that really feels like you've made a dent on your own proverbial rock, doesn't it?
So here we are midway through your conversation about being in a consulting practice, working with some titans of industry, and fast forward a bit. And now almost exactly 2 years ago, you launched a company.
I did. Yeah. A company that I'm really passionate about, actually, because, it was grounded in the experiences. I guess people start companies for all sorts of reasons, right? I'm one of those people who doesn't have enough discipline to get out of bed and work hard for something I'm not absolutely completely committed to. I think there are other people who are able to just do that for something that they just think is...
They're the grinders.
They're the grinders. And I respect them for making those choices. I just lack that internal clock to do anything other than work for something that I'm just consumed by. And so I have to point myself in the direction.
I have to find joy in what I do too. That's why I'm not employed in corporate America anymore.
Yeah. And I think increasingly I'm not employable in those contexts.
So on your LinkedIn profile, there's a red circle that says not open to work.
Yeah, that's right. There's a red circle that says, this guy's going to ask a lot of annoying questions. And I found that out the last time I went into a company, I asked all those annoying questions and had to sort of find my way back into being a corporate citizen again, which took a minute. It does take a minute once you've started something and then you have to go back in. But we're now at a stage now where hopefully that won't have to happen. I learned a lot from a lot of those leaders, but also realized that it's all well and good learning to lead well if you've got access to limitless resources. And when I say limitless resources, I mean, some of these people are on, 7-figure salary, 8-figure comp. It's a different story when you're somebody who's early in your career and you're on the front line. And increasingly, I think I was learning and continue to be of the belief that the person who has just made the transition from not being a leader into leadership is the one who has the toughest deal, because you've done this amazing job of being successful in your technical field, whatever that might be. You could be a fantastic salesperson, and maybe the corollary is higher with sales and leadership, but it might be lower with something like engineering or some of these other fields. And so you're brilliant at that. And then all of a sudden somebody says, hey, listen, how do you want to go from being like in an 80% technical job in whatever you're doing to a job where 60% of your time is going to be spent on purely interpersonal skills, empathy, all these other things that are going to be important to you? Most people flounder. I mean, there's a reason why 82% of early career managers consider themselves accidental managers. And there's a reason why a third of their teams leave within a year because of their manager.
Or the primary reason why salespeople stay or go is not because of compensation, right? Their manager is their pivot point for, can I close deals? Can I get the help I need? Can I properly get my customer served? Can I get the information they need? Can I get air cover for what senior management or HR is asking me? Can I do what I want to do? Right? Or are they going to bury me in pipeline inspections and expense statements and they're going to keep me from doing my job? The manager, right, has a big influence on comp, but it's the manager that keeps or loses a salesperson.
If you've got targets, you've got quotas, you want to perform if you're a salesperson, right? If you want to be a performance salesperson and somebody's getting in your way because they're laying all this extra stuff all over you and you're not actually getting to do the work, which is the work of selling, then it's a distraction, I imagine. And so I wonder how many salespeople, or in fact, anybody who's going to be an employee at a company I wonder how much time someone spends on interviewing or understanding the manager versus just understanding the company they're going to go and work at.
That was always a question I would ask. I would always ask the question. Back when I thought I wanted to be in, a corporate do-gooder. What is your management style? And half the time people go, I'm very much of a hands-off manager. Bullshit.
You are until you aren't. Do you know what I mean? That's the thing about hands-off manager. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just laissez-faire.
Yeah, calling you at 8 o'clock on Sunday. I need that report by 8 a.m. So you were talking about people with 7-figure incomes and 8-figure comp. They're the exception as leaders. Most of the leaders in the States are owners of small businesses or mid-sized businesses, 30, 50 million companies out there where they might be taking home 5 figures or 6.
Yeah, that's the engine room of America's economy, right?
Yeah. And so there's a huge gulf there for supporting them on how to be leaders and influencers.
Yeah, look, if you are in the C-suite for a 200,000 person telco, you probably have access to 2 or 3 resources that are just guided towards your self-development. I mean, there are people who have been hired by the company.
Executive coaches.
Exactly. And they work in service of making sure that you are adequately supported to make the right choices when you need to. And there'll be multiple lines of that, multiple lines of admin, multiple lines, you've got all the support and resources you need, including your own, significant wealth at that point. But if you're somebody who is building a small business, or maybe you've just making the transition into leading and managing people for the first time, I remember when I did it, I was 24. I was sort of walked into the newsroom of the music magazine, this much hallowed music magazine that was sort of almost 50 years old. And I was completely in awe of the work that had been done there over the course of the decades before me. And they said, here's your team, here's your office, here's your assistant, what do you want to do? And that was exactly right. And I immediately just felt the cold sweats and spent the next half an hour standing inside the cubicles of the 1960s office, inside the toilet with my forehead pressed against the door, inside the cubicle, just thinking, what have I done? Because I thought I was actually interviewing for a more junior role than the one I had ended up picking up. And so after half an hour, I thought, well, I can't stand in here all day. I'm going to have to get out there and actually start doing whatever it is my job. And so at the age of 24, I went out there and I started doing my job, and I was horrific at managing people, no less than that. I was one of those people, and I think this is a lot of early career managers, who oscillated wildly between massively over-delegating and completely laissez-faire, lean back, sit back. And I had none of the vocabulary or really the spidey sense that you develop over time to be able to run in between. And it took me 10 years, I think, from 24 to 34, to even start to develop an ability to be able to start to lead people and manage people, lots of hard knocks. And I probably didn't ask for feedback until I was 28, just 4 years of leading people and not asking for any feedback. So I feel bad for Emily and Carol and all these other people that I was managing at that. But I mean,
I've got names too I can share.
Right, exactly. And they were all wonderful, but I don't know if I was the best leader for them. Anyway, you learn eventually, right? One way or another, you get the feedback you need, provided you don't flame out.
So one of my favorite books is The Art of Facilitation. It has 2 great learnings. One is only ask questions, which is the difference between teaching or telling and really helping people learn on their own. And the other is leave your ego at the door, you idiot. And until I got a handle on my ego, I was a shitty manager. And I've seen that replicated hundreds of times, right? The best leaders, the best sales managers, the best coaches, the best facilitators, the best spouses, the best siblings leave their ego out of the conversation. It takes a lot of work to do that. A lot of awareness first.
Yeah, I wish somebody had handed me that book. And also I question whether I would have had the temerity to read it in July 2004. But, there's something about being able to understand your own ego. I found that particularly hard, I think, because we were in a whirlwind of what people refer to as the indie sleaze music era in the UK. And so all of these bands were popping up, and we were really at the center of culture in a way that I didn't anticipate. And at the age of 24, I didn't really know how to handle that. And so, you're writing a column and people are walking up to you in the street going, hey, will you listen to my tape? And I read your column this week. That stuff, it does tend to inflate one's ego in a way that you don't necessarily expect.
And there were a lot of bad habits going on at that time too. It wasn't the healthiest of environments.
It wasn't the healthiest of environments, for many reasons, but we were a staff of, I want to say, 18, maybe 16 full time. I'm in my mid 40s. 4 of us are no longer around. It's not a healthy profession being a music journalist, and it certainly wasn't back then. And, there are various reasons why that stuff happens. It's not all self-inflicted. I certainly realized that I had to get out of that profession and go and do something that was more sustainable for me on a number of levels. And one of them was just for my own health.
Ben, I'm going to bring you back to the
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I digress.
No. Put two people with healthy cases of ADHD together and like,
It's
boom.
true.
Good news.
I'm sorry.
Good news.
I'm sorry for my part in that. Yeah.
Unlimited content. So leadership and sales are the same thing today. 15 years ago, customers didn't really know what they needed. You could tell them what they needed and they would buy it or not. I'm simplifying just slightly. Today, customers still don't know what they need, right? I had Ted McKenna on who co-wrote The Jolt Effect, and he said, you have to lead customers. You have to tell them what they need. I'm paraphrasing. You have to limit their options. You have to show them how to make the decisions. It's all about leadership. There's a component of change management. It's having the confidence, but not ego, to take them to where they need to go, even though they might not know that they should go there, and they might go kicking and screaming. So let's get to what you're doing now, because when you and I first got together, the phrase that really caught my attention was leadership intelligence. There's a piece of it in sales. There's a piece of it in general leadership. And let's focus on that last part. And for the listeners, it's absolutely portable back and forth.
Makes sense to me. Look, the way I think about leadership intelligence, and I think it's completely applicable to in the sales context as well. There's a time in most highly technical fields where the field arrives on the scene and you're just trying to figure out how to do it best. But at some point, there's sort of the advent of some kind of instrumentation for that field. So you think about planes, for example, right? At some point, it was like two pedals and maybe something that resembled a joystick. I imagine back in the Wright brothers era, I'm not even sure we had that, but it's pretty rough. As an early pilot, you sort of learn how to look at the horizon and you're managing the throttle and those kinds of things so that you can try and get the lift. But then, the second certification you get is instrument flying. And then beyond that, you go and then become a commercial pilot. My belief is that leadership has been going on for a long, long time, obviously. But for the last few decades, for as long as we've been working in the context of all this technology, we actually haven't built an instrument layer for leadership. And so I wondered what it would look like for you to be able to go and build an instrument layer for leadership for folks who are just starting out, so that you can get used to that instrument layer. We use Strava, we use Aura rings. There's all sorts of different ways for you to kind of go and get a measured version of yourself, right? So on the personal side, and so increasing, and I know there are products out there that help you just with the act of selling, or at least helping, your sales manager have a more understanding of how you're selling is probably what those tools are doing more. But how do you invest in your own performance? How do you really make sure that you're doing well? And to do that, you really need an instrumentation layout.
You mean 360-degree listening circles isn't sufficient?
Right, 360-degree listening circles. I mean, look, I'm a big fan of feedback from all directions. I do think that everyone should ritualize that and find a way to make sure they're getting the feedback and inviting the feedback from all different directions. The challenge I would have with just using that alone and not augmenting it with something more is that it just doesn't happen often enough. It's kind of a pain, right, to go and ask all of your people, especially people who are more senior than you, but even people who are more junior than you, like, how am I doing? Like, what's going on? Like, can you give me feedback? Like, there are ways to ask for feedback, of course, but you can't do that at the level of repetition with which you need to in order to really build great expertise. That's leadership. And so for us, building leadership intelligence has suddenly become possible because we've got the advent of AI, but also there are many science-based methods to understanding what's going on in your cognitive state now based on the language you emit in a conversation, for example. So the field of psycholinguistics, cognitive science, behavioral science, these are all ways for us to understand more about like what's going on inside. And we can now do that at the speed of compute.
So the geek in me, Ben, and as someone that actually launched a startup many, many years ago to do sentiment analysis inside an organization using the one commonly available archive of communications back then. What are your inputs for this platform?
At the moment, we use transcript data and also the rest of the communication that happens inside the meetings that you have with your team. So the way that Parafoil works is it's a desktop app, soon to be a mobile app too. You install it on your machine. And then when you've got a meeting, it analyzes the meeting that you're having with your team. And so whether that's a group meeting or a one-to-one, it looks at the conversational data, it looks at the way you show up, it looks at your voice intonation, all those kinds of things to really understand what's going on with you in that moment and how are you coming across. Because at the very least, understanding how I'm perceived, like I'm in this podcast right now, we're looking at each other through video. There's a part of my cognitive cycle that's thinking, how am I going to be perceived when people are listening to and watching this? And it matters to me, because I care about it. And so, Parafoil lifts some of the burden of that off you in the moment so that you can go and investigate it later. And after every conversation that you have, it sends you a report. So you almost get like a report card for every meeting you have that says, hey, listen, your leadership style was this. These are some things that you did. Here's some things you might do better next time if you want to be more in keeping with the leadership style you're going for. And here are some actions you can take right now to try and improve your leadership with this person next time. And we do that all within minutes.
So just on a joking basis, can I have Arnold Schwarzenegger read me that input? Hey, Lay, you did a shitty job here.
I mean, hypothetically, I suppose you could at this point.
Or Katy Perry. That was great. We should do it this way.
Yeah. I mean, look, hypothetically, all those things are out now actually very possible.
They were doing that in Waze for a while. You could get driving instructions they were actual live voices. People recorded them and then they parted them together. So what other sources? Have you thought about email and Slack and other?
Yeah. So, right now we really want to make sure that the meeting is well covered. But in future, I think like increasing the surface area of your leadership is going to be important for us to really have enough context to be able to understand how you lead in different contexts.
Yeah. And sometimes there's one form of communication that's face-to-face. There's another form that's phone. There's a third form that's perhaps typed, an email or text. And you're sending different messages from each one.
Some people deploy different styles. And some people, by the way, are like great at email, but terrible at meetings. And so the full picture of your leadership is something that we're sort of seeking to build a better understanding of so that we can run as telemetry alongside. Maybe you and your coach can go, if you have a coach, can go back through and look at the record and be like, hey, listen, let's listen back to that moment and find out what happened. Because you talking about it obviously is beneficial, but also we can both go and do a post-match report. In soccer in the UK, we call that the VAR, where we can go back through and look at how the goal was scored and whether that person was offside or not. I'm sure that there are similar things in American sports too, where you go back and look at whether or not it was a decent field goal or whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about. So that's what we built. It's a way for you to go and do that in the minute to minute, in the day to day, so that you can tighten the reps for improvement. My belief is praxis is the best way to learn how to lead, which means you need the knowledge, you need the theory, you need to understand, you need opportunities to be able to put it into practice and be able to change your behavior in real time. And so we're just trying to shorten those loops, because if I wait until somebody gives me a training course and it's once every 6 months, again, great for knowledge. The time between when I learn that stuff and when I can put it into practice is pretty long.
Right. You need the feedback in the moment.
You need the feedback in the moment. And I need to know that when I've just had a one-to-one with one person, that it kind of went like this. And so maybe in my next one-to-one, I should be thinking slightly differently about how I approach that stuff and not waiting until 6 weeks down the road when I've already formed an impression with them.
So there are tools that perform a similar function to evaluate selling conversations. You talk more than you listen, these were the words you used. Your focus is very specifically not on sales, but on leadership, which is, it's kind of the core of business, right? If leaders aren't doing a good job, everyone else is floundering.
One thing I certainly learned in consulting is that your organizational culture lives at the front line of managers. That's where you carry the culture for the organization. That's where behavior gets influenced and behavior is held. That's where the rituals are actually play out, like whether they happen or not. That's where all of the work that you try and make real in the kind of 2 to 3 year, the strategy of the organization will either happen or not on the basis of whether or not your frontline managers are aligned with it.
And you know what they say, culture eats strategy for lunch. It's like, we can talk about strategy all we want, but whatever the people are doing out in the field, that's not going to get changed by a memo.
Right. And as a former strategy consultant, I will tell you that is 100% accurate, because culture change projects take 3 years, but you can shift your organizational strategy in 6 months, whatever size you're at. Now, if you're a small business, I hope you can do it in a lot less time than that, but culture eats strategy every time. And so I think, at an individual level, we've built a product that means that individuals can use this for their own leadership. And that's the goal. It's completely private and individual to that person. They only share what they want to share. But there is a sort of HR learning and development teams version as well, where only limited content is filtered up to the HR team. And that helps them also say, look, we're going to invest in you. Here's some tools for you to go and use. We only see limited things like what is the shape of the culture en masse, but nothing about any individual privately.
Yeah, interesting. I could see where you could be doing benchmarking across teams or across groups or across levels and say, okay, at the mid-manager level, we need better listening skills or messaging. And that's actionable, right? Sorry, actionable is a legal term. That's something you can act on.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's something you can act on, and you can start to say, hey, listen, over in this area, we need a bit more support. You can get individuals involved to help them with that support. You can do more. There's all sorts of different interventions you can use. And it helps you not just have to go and send a pulse survey out every 6 weeks, because once again, self-reported data is not as accurate as data that's gathered, through the course of the conversation anyway. And so you can do the personality test stuff, but you can also do pulse surveys and start to understand, get early signals of burnout and those kinds of things before people are even starting to actually make the decision to leave.
That's really cool. What you're essentially doing, and I think you use this phrase, you're putting a dashboard on the health of leadership.
That's the goal. And to do it in a way that is safe and protects the individuals and doesn't impede upon their safety. It's non-invasive, and nothing about you as an individual gets shared with your company. That's really important because you need a private place to be able to go and improve. But the company maybe wants a reading.
And there is something in it for the individual of that real-time feedback of talk less, ask more questions.
That's right. Ask more questions. And we can even go further than that. We can say, when you're asking questions, maybe try asking more like reflexive-based questions because you want to be more into the reflexive listening space, because we recognize that this is a person who responds well to that, because we can look at the interplay between the two of you and really start to understand at a behavioral level, provided that both parties have consented to it, how they might be able to work better together.
That's absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to see how this develops over time. It seems to me, having been in the corporate world for many, many years, getting back to that 360 degree, the last one I was in, the recipient of that input talked for 80% of the time.
Right.
It's like, I thought this was a listening circle. Instead, it was just another talk circle. That could have been in an email.
It could have been in an email, and so many leaders think that they're there to broadcast information.
Even in a listening circle.
Yeah, even in a listening circle, your job is to invite feedback. And also, why in that moment would you jeopardize or waste that opportunity for growth? I think that's the thing. Like, you have to develop enough ego, right? You have to develop enough self-awareness to be able to say, my ego isn't what's important here. Even if I do have one, what's important here is I could get good. And that's a better way to serve your ego.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a fascinating conversation, Ben. Where can people find you?
Thanks, Lee. I've really enjoyed it. So the URL is parafoil.co, Parafoil.co. And you can email the entire company, humans@parafoil.co. We have a moratorium on no reply emails. So any email you ever get from us is always replyable. I don't believe in no reply emails. I don't understand why they exist. Why would you not want a reply? So humans@parafoil.co is the way to email us, and we hope people do.
Awesome. Well, best of luck, Ben. I'm looking forward to an update soon.
Thanks, Lee. I can't wait to share more.
Thanks, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure for me.
Another deep dive into the topic of sales excellence and the performance mindset. If you found this conversation interesting, I would appreciate it if you would share the podcast with a coworker or two. And to explore this topic in more depth, send me a note via the contact form on podcast.thoughtsonselling.com or find some time for us to talk at meet.acellergroup.com. Thanks.